All right, everyone, we're going to continue our tutorials, and this time we're going to be working with the Type as Element page. And you get to it by opening up your document, coming over here to your panel on the right, clicking on Pages, and then double-clicking Page 4. That'll bring you here. Now, I know it doesn't say Type as an element because the word type is one that you will be adding. I'll give you an example of this is what we are shooting for. And if you need any help at all during this tutorial, you can also consult the student guide. All right, I'm going to move this over to the side. Now, one of the things I want you to understand about working with text and the limit of this tutorial is that I'm only going to cover the basics here. We're going to spend an additional full week on just working with type because type is such an important part of any graphic design, especially when you're dealing with digital layout. You need to cover fonts. There's things like paragraph styles. There's also things like leading. There's so many different concepts just to deal with the fundamentals of working with text. And then there's also the creative side of working with type, which is a little bit about what you read about inside that inside the lesson. So just know that we're going to be spending a lot more time working with text in future modules. This is only going to show you the basics. All right, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started and let's create a type box. But before we do that, I'm going to go and switch my view mode. You'll notice right now, you don't see any guides or margins or anything else. That's because I'm in basically preview mode, which is one that I like to work in quite a bit. But in this particular case, when working with type, it's going to be a little bit easier if I can see the bounding boxes of all of our elements. So I'm going to go up to view. I'm going to come down to screen mode, and I'm going to change it back to normal. And the reason I talk about this with text is because whenever you're working with the text tool, if you accidentally select any box that is a text box, it's going to assume that you want to continue typing inside of that. So when you're trying to place an element on a page, it can be rather difficult if there's already other text boxes on there. So this will at least show me where all my text boxes are. All right, so I'm going to take my zoom tool and we're going to put the word type in here, but I want to kind of zoom in a little bit closer so it's easier to see. I'm going to close over my pages. All right, so to create our text box, what I want to do is use the type tool, and you can find that over inside your toolbar. I'm going to come down here till you get to the T, and I'm going to click on it. Here's my type tool. Now, whenever you're working with the type tool, you want to make sure that if you're going to be adding a new box or a new text box, you want to make sure that you don't click inside of a current text element. For example, if I did this, instead of adding a new text box, it's going to assume I simply want to pick up where I left off typing. We don't want to do that. So whenever you want to add a text box, always make sure to click and drag outside of the other elements, especially the other text elements. So what I'm going to do is, just as we have already done with other tools, is I'm going to click and drag a text box. I'm going to let go, and now I'm ready to start typing in. So in this particular case, we're going to use the word type in all lowercase. Now, before we begin to make some of the changes, I want you to understand that if you want to apply the same change to all text within inside of a text box, you simply select the actual text box. And whatever changes you make, for example, to the font, to the color, or whatever else, it will apply to everything within inside of that text box. If you only want to select a certain portion of text, then you basically have to double click inside the text box and then highlight that portion of text that you want to affect. Just keep that in mind as we start working with these things. In this particular case, we're going to be affecting the entire word type, and that is the only type that we have inside the box. So because of that, I'm just going to come over here and switch to my selection tool. This way it selects the entire text box, and I'm going to come over here to my properties panel. In my properties panel, I'm going to scroll all the way down until I get to character. Now I want to talk about a few things as it relates to this particular panel. Now keep in mind, you're going to be exploring this panel in a lot more detail in future modules, so I'm just going to cover just a few of the basics of things I want you to understand. First off, when it comes to characters, this first box, this is going to be your font. And so if you're going to change the font, you're going to do that right here. And if you click the drop down, this will pull up all of the fonts that you currently have inside your system. Your computer or whatever else, and there are ways to add Adobe fonts, and we'll be doing that in a completely different module. But I think Minion Pro is pretty common, so you should have that, especially if it's an Adobe product. All right, so I'm going to click out of that. Now, the drop down directly below that, that's going to control your styles. So this particular font has multiple styles. It has a regular, semi-bold, bold, and you can see all the other ones that are currently listed. So font style, or type style, however you want to say it. This one right here, this is going to control our font size. So for example, in this particular case, it says that our font needs to be 175 points. So I'm going to type in 175, and notice how big that makes that. Now, tell you, since I'm talking about font size, something to keep in mind is if you didn't draw your text box big enough, you'll notice that whenever you type or you change something, if it suddenly disappears and you see this red box down here in the bottom right corner, that just indicates that you have text that is too big for the current size of your box. And so all you simply have to do is to make your box larger to account for that. Okay? All right, so that is our size. Now this one right here, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail as whenever we affect our paragraph, but this deals with leading. This is the space between lines of text, and I'm going to come back to that here in just a moment. All right, so we've adjusted the size of our text to be 175 point. Now you notice I've got all this extra space around my actual type box. Now, one of the things I do like about InDesign is that a lot of times when you're working with multiple text elements and you're trying to select a bunch of different things, it can be difficult because of all this extra space around text. When you're trying to click on one thing, it wants to select the text box. So you can actually shrink the size of this text box a little bit more by, notice over here, you can double click this center point right here, and notice what it does. It makes it a little bit more closer. You can also do the same thing on the bottom. And it'll basically bring it up to the baseline of your actual text. Now that we've got that, let's go ahead and rotate this to match what we have inside of our finished guide. So to rotate this, it's the same thing as it is with any other element. Move your mouse outside the actual box, and again, notice how the icon changes to that curved arch. Click and drag. All right, now to constrain this, because we want to basically keep it tight in 90 degrees, hold down the Shift key. Again, that's going to constrain it to 45-degree increments. There's the first one. And keep holding down the Shift key as you move it. And there it is. There's our 90 degrees. And we let go, and that's what we have. We're going to basically move it into place. And what I'm kind of going for is so that the P and the Y, those extenders down here, or descenders, are between these two elements. Don't worry if you don't get it exactly right, because that is what the next bit is for. All right, so with that in place, we can also come up here to our X and Y values. So these are always good to use, especially if we're working with text. And so in this particular case, we want to use the left bottom reference point. So I'm going to click on that. And again, that is looking at this point right here. Okay. So for our left bottom reference point, we want that to be 0. This is going to indicate that our text box needs to sit on the edge of our document. And again, notice the default space that you have in there. So the text is not touching the edge, which gives you all this extra space anyway. So our text box is going to touch the edge, which is perfect. And finally, we want to take a look at the Y value, which controls up and down. And our Y value needs to be 10.0654. I'm going to hit that. Just moves it down. And so now, let's zoom out. We've got our first element. We created a text box and we rotated it. And we also resized it accordingly by double clicking it. All right, so for the next bit, let's go and make this element, these type elements, the paper white. So I'm going to zoom in on those. Now, if you've got text on there, you need to change the color. You can do a couple things. Remember, as we've talked about earlier, if you need to affect only a certain amount of text within inside of a box, you can click inside the box and highlight the section that you want. But in this particular case, we're going to be making both elements white. So we can actually select on the actual text box using our selection tool, the black arrow, and because of that, it's going to select all the text inside of it. And whatever change we apply to the box affects everything within it. So with that in mind, I'm going to close out my properties panel. And we're going to make this text white by going to my swatches. Whenever you're working with color in text, you need to pay very close attention to what's happening right in here. There's a couple different things. First off, you're going to notice two icons, a square and a T for text. If the square is highlighted, any color that you apply either as a fill or to the stroke is only going to affect the bounding box. So kind of give you an example. If I have the fill selected and that box is highlighted, watch what happens if I apply the cyan. It applies the fill to the inside of the box, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to change that back to none. And the same thing, if you happen to have the stroke selected and did the same thing, you're probably not going to be able to see it, but there it is. It applies the stroke to the box. And notice what happened, because doing so, it now tells me that my bounding box is not big enough for my actual text. So I'm going to click none on that, which brings that back. Now, to affect color on text, you want to make sure to click the T. So we're going to click on the T, and again, you have the same thing. You have both the fill and a stroke. So for example, if I click on the fill button, this is going to change the color of the overall text. So make sure you've got the T selected here. You've got this T, the fill part selected, and click on paper. Now by default, paper is always going to be 100%. You can't have anything less than white. You can't have a percentage of white. So just sort of keep that in mind. Now, again, just to kind of emphasize, if you have this selected, this is the stroke. If you were to apply a stroke to it, notice it applies it to the outside of the letter forms. Okay, but I'm going to make that back to none. This is what it should be. So again, we selected the entire text box. We made sure that we had the text tool selected for color. And then we made sure that we applied it to the fill and, of course, the color white. So let's do that with the as and. I'm going to click on that particular text box. Now notice I'm trying to click on it, but it's not selecting it because it's sitting inside this other text box. So InDesign is like, you've already got the box selected. So let's go and select, see how it extends on the outside here? Let's select the text box on the outside. Makes it a little bit easier to select. All right, so with that selected, any color we change is going to apply to everything within inside of that particular box. Come over here to my swatches and notice what happens. By default, it always goes back to that square. So click on the T, make sure that you have the fill selected, and click on paper. And that's it. So if we zoom back out, notice what we have. Type as an element is all white, and type over here is black. All right, so now let's jump over to our paragraph and start playing with it. So for our paragraph, I'm going to go back to my selection tool and I'm going to select the overall text. So with our text box selected, we want to do a few more things with this. So first off, let's open up our properties panel. Come down here to our, scroll down to our character panel, this area right here. So in this particular case, the 12-point type is fine. So that is okay. We need a regular style, which is completely fine. But we want to change a couple things. The first thing we want to change is the leading. The leading is the space between lines of text. In old print type, they would typically use pieces of lead to separate lines of text. And so that's where we get the word leading. So if you wanted more space between the top line and the next line underneath it, you simply increase the amount of lead that you would use. So let's adjust the leading. And so this is a rule of thumb, and we're going to talk about this more and more as we go throughout the semester. But typically when I'm trying to decide on a leading size, I don't often use the default that comes inside of the program. And most graphic designers won't either. So you'll notice right here our 12-point type, and then we have a leading of 14.4. So there's only a 2.4 difference between the top line and the line underneath it, as well as subsequent lines beyond that. The typical rule of thumb is you can go anywhere from 4 to 8 points larger for your leading. So in this particular case, if we were to do 4, this would become 16. So if I were to highlight that by double clicking it and change it to 16, notice I get extra space between the lines. But at 12 points and with this particular font, I'm going to choose 18. Okay, I just happen to like it. I think it helps with the readability. And it's not so much so if you have too much leading, here's what happens with that. It becomes a little bit more difficult to read, and basically each line of text becomes more noticeable. The space becomes a little bit distracting. Okay, so we no longer begin to see paragraphs of text. We begin to see individual lines of text, and that's not what we want. So we want to choose something that enhances readability, but isn't too much. So 18 seems to work fine, and again, that's 6 points larger than the original font size. So again, anywhere from 4 to 8 points, you should be good. And again, that can always vary depending upon the font that you have, and you're going to learn about that in upcoming modules. All right, so we've adjusted the leading between these. Now the next thing we want to do is notice right here at our paragraph, we don't have a lot of space right here. It seems to sit right underneath that one. So we want to increase the space after our paragraph. So I'm going to keep scrolling down until I come to this section right here. And these are all our paragraph settings. So you can have left alignment, center alignment, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all these because we're going to spend time on that much later on. But the one I want you to pay attention to is this one right here, the space after. So you can control the space after the paragraph by typing in a number. In this particular case, it's going to be 0.125. So 0.125, which is basically 1/8 of an inch. And notice what happens to this space right there once I hit enter. So any paragraph now has that same space. I think 1/8 seems to work fine for most jobs. I have seen where some will put in 0.25, usually up to you, but in this particular case, let's do 0.125. And it automatically adds that space after every single paragraph. And the reason it does that, because we selected the entire text box, and any change we make to the text box will have an effect on everything within inside of it. Okay, so to add a drop cap, what we're going to do is we're going to basically add a drop cap to the top paragraph right here. And a drop cap is where you usually have a single letter or letters that are a little bit bigger than all the rest of the text. And so to easily add a drop cap, you're going to click inside your text box and click right in front of that first letter. So having clicked right in front of that first letter, we're going to come over to our Properties panel and then scroll over to the Paragraph Settings. And if you come down right here, this is your drop cap. Now this controls the number of lines, or basically the height of your drop cap. So if we type in 3, the L is going to take up 3 lines of text. Now, if we wanted to extend that beyond just a single letter, that would be to the right of the drop cap right here, to this little text box right here. So for example, if we typed in 2, it would add the first 2 letters. It would make those a drop cap inside that paragraph. I'm going to change that back to 1. And so the nice thing is, notice how we just did it in this top paragraph instead of the entire document. So anywhere that you want to add a particular drop cap, usually it's always going to be the first paragraph. Just click inside the paragraph that you want to apply it to. And that's it. All right, so the next piece is we want to select this right here, and we want to add a text wrap. And so what text wrap does is, you'll notice right now, this is difficult to read because this is sitting on top of text underneath it. So what a text wrap does, it wraps text all the way around, or pushes text around your element that you have selected. So in this particular case, we're going to click on our grouped text. We're going to come up here to Window, and let's pull up our text wrap panel, and I'm going to close out Properties just for the moment for screen space. So here's our text wrap, and right now it has none. But I want you to select the second one, which is Wrap Around the Bounding Box. So right now you kind of see our bounding box is this rectangle. So with that selected, click on that. Notice what happens. It automatically shifts the text below and above this text box, or whatever shape that we have selected. So we are wrapping the text around this object. All right, the next thing that we need to do is we need to change this to a different font, the word strong. As good as it is, when it says type as a strong element of design, this doesn't seem to be as strong as I would like it. So even though we've already got the text box selected, we're going to double click and double click again till you get to the word strong, and then highlight it, because again, we only want to affect that word, not the entire text box. So we want to just select that word. So basically keep clicking till you get to that word. Come over to your Properties. I'm going to close out my text wrap here. In my Properties panel, come down to your character. We want to change the font to be Myriad Pro. And this, I'm hoping, should be one that you have inside your system. If not, find something else that seems very similar. So I'm going to choose Myriad Pro. Myriad Pro. I'm going to click on it. That's my font. And according to our study guide, the style needs to be bold. There you go. So we change the font and we change the style. And if I click on the outside, I'm going to go back to my selection tool up here at the top. I'm going to click on it and then click off to the side. And now you can see what it looks like. All right, for the very last piece, let's scroll all the way down here. The last piece is that we want to change the color of this text. So we're going to select the text box. Again, make sure you've got this text box selected and not the other one behind it. All right, so click on your text. And according to this, it needs to be 60% black. Let's go to our swatches. Again, make sure that you have the T selected. Click on the T first. And then again, make sure that you have the text fill option. Change it. It's currently black. Change it to 60%. Okay. All right, and let's highlight the word move. Type can move you. So we talked about primary and secondary meaning. So let's add that secondary meaning to this text. We're going to double click it to get inside the text box and then highlight the word move. We're going to come over to our properties panel and we're going to, for our character, we're going to make it bold. And in this particular case, we also want to give it a slant or a skew, which is this right here. So we're going to skew this 15 degrees. Now, the only time I'd ever recommend you use the skew, again, notice when I highlight it what it says. Skew false italic. By default, most fonts, when you open up the styles, will probably already have an italic. But if it doesn't quite have the slant that you want, you can always sort of force it. There's mixed feelings about this. I would just say always be careful. You never want to go to an extreme because it will just look horribly bad. Okay, so let's put that back at 15. All right, and so if we close out our properties panel, we come up to View, Fit Page, and Window. Let's go ahead and go to our normal view, View, Screen Mode, Preview. That way we get to see it without all the extra guides and everything else or bounding boxes. And I'm going to click on my selection tool and then click off to the side to deselect everything. All right, looks very, very good.